The incident report was filed on a Wednesday. This was notable because the Keth Research Collective had been operating their xenobiology division for 200 years and had never filed an incident report before. Not once. They had studied 47 species across 6 decades of active fieldwork. They had documented things that had surprised them, things that had confused them, things that had required multiple rounds of peer review before the broader scientific community accepted the findings. None of those things had risen to the level of an incident report. The human had been at the research station for 11 days. The report was 6 pages long. It included 17 data tables, 4 appendices, and a recommendation section that the division head had personally reviewed 3 times before signing, because she wanted to be certain that what it said was what she actually meant. It said, "We recommend a full review of the parameters used to assess biological resilience in carbon-based species, with specific reference to the implicit assumption that pain response in observed species functions as a reliable indicator of physical limit. We further recommend that any future study involving human subjects include an expanded briefing protocol addressing the gap between human pain expression and human physical capacity. We further recommend that the research team be given access to counseling resources. The events of days 7 through 11 were unexpected, and several team members have expressed a need to process what they observed." The division head sent the report to the Oversight Committee. The Oversight Committee read it and sent back one question. What exactly happened on days 7 through 11? She wrote back a summary. Then she sent the full observation logs. Then she requested a meeting. The human's name was Sergeant Marcus Webb. He was 31 years old, had been in the Alliance Marine Corps for 9 years, and had volunteered for the Keth Xenobiology Exchange Program because his commanding officer had described it as light duty and a good opportunity to represent humanity in a scientific context, and Webb had the particular quality of a person who found the phrase scientific context appealing in a way that not everyone did. He arrived at the Keth Research Station with 2 bags, a collection of personal reading material that the receiving researcher had catalogued as extensive, and an energy level that the station logs would later describe, in the careful language of scientific documentation, as immediately notable. The lead researcher assigned to the human study was Dr. Preth, a being of considerable academic distinction who had spent 40 years in xenobiology and who approached the human assignment with the organized thoroughness that characterized her entire career. She had read everything available on human physiology before Webb arrived. She had prepared a study protocol. She had briefed her team. She was, by every professional standard, ready. She was not ready. Day 1 went well. Orientation, baseline measurements, the standard physical assessment that the Keth used for all new study subjects, calibrated to the subject's known species parameters. Webb was cooperative, good-humored, and asked more questions about the research equipment than Dr. Preth had anticipated, several of which she found genuinely interesting. Day 2 went well. More baseline measurements, cognitive assessments, a preliminary review of the pain response protocols that would be used in subsequent sessions. Webb listened to the explanation of the protocols with the attentive expression of someone who was following everything and said, when Dr. Preth finished, that it all sounded fine and asked if there was anywhere on the station he could do his morning exercise routine. There was a fitness facility. She showed him to it. Day 3 was when things began to deviate from the study protocol in ways that Dr. Preth's notes, written that evening, described as requiring further consideration. The pain response protocol used by the Keth Xenobiology Division was the standard instrument for assessing biological pain thresholds across species. It involved controlled application of specific stimuli at calibrated intensities, combined with continuous monitoring of physiological stress indicators, and was designed to identify the threshold at which a subject's behavior changed in ways consistent with pain avoidance response. The threshold was the data point. It told you where the biological limit was. Webb sat in the assessment chair, and Dr. Preth began the protocol at the standard starting intensity, which for a human-sized carbon-based organism with the physiology parameters Webb had presented should have produced a mild but clear response. Webb said, "Is it on?" Dr. Preth checked the instrument. It was on. She said, "Yes, do you feel something?" He said, "A little bit of warmth, is that right?" Oh, she said, "Yeah." As she made a note, she increased the intensity to the second calibration level. He said, "Okay, I feel that. That is more warmth." As she increased to the third level. He said, "Yeah, that is noticeable. Kind of like when you lean against something hot by accident." He paused. "Is this going to get more intense?" She said, "Yes. The protocol continues until we identify the threshold point." He said, "Okay, sure." He settled back in the chair. "I should mention that I have a pretty high pain tolerance. My co used to say I was not properly calibrated for self-preservation." He smiled. "She used to say it as a criticism, but I think she mostly meant it affectionately." Dr. Preth made a note. She increased to the fourth level. He said, "There we go. That one has some character to it." He was still completely settled in the chair. His physiological indicators were elevated, as expected at this intensity. What was not expected was that they were elevated at the level of mild exertion rather than the level of pain avoidance stress that the protocol was designed to produce. As she increased to the fifth level, he said, "Okay, that is genuinely uncomfortable." He did not move. His expression changed to the concentration expression of someone working through something, but his posture was the same. He said, "I would describe that as actually hurting." He paused. "Are you getting good readings?" She said somewhat automatically, "Yes." She was looking at the physiological data and not fully processing that she was looking at it. As she increased to the sixth level. The sixth level was, in the Keth protocol, the level at which every species previously studied had demonstrated clear behavioral pain avoidance response. The physiological indicators at this level for most species were at the ceiling of the stress measurement range. Subjects typically attempted to terminate the assessment. The data from the sixth level usually exceeded what was needed. Webb said, He shifted slightly in the chair, the way a person shifts when they are more comfortable in a different position. His physiological indicators went up. His behavior did not change in the pain avoidance direction. He said, "That one is pretty significant." He looked at her. "Is my face doing something? It feels like my face might be doing something." She looked at her monitor. His expression was, according to the facial mapping system, consistent with discomfort and effort. It was not consistent with the pain avoidance behavioral pattern. Oh, she said, "You are managing." He said, "I am managing." He nodded. "Okay." He looked at the instrument. "I want to be useful to your study. Should I keep going?" Dr. Preth made several notes in rapid succession. Then she said, "I would like to continue if you are willing." Oh, he said, "Sure." Day 3's session continued for 45 minutes past the standard protocol endpoint. Dr. Preth's notes from that evening began with standard data documentation and became increasingly non-standard as they continued. At intensity level 8, which was a level the Keth instrument had never been used at in a live subject assessment because no previous subject had reached it, Webb had described the sensation as extremely unpleasant and had also asked whether the station had anything good for lunch because the assessment was scheduled before midday and he had not eaten. At level 9, he had said with complete seriousness, "I want you to know I am taking this very seriously." He had then asked if she could take a measurement of his grip strength while the assessment was running because he was curious whether it was affected. She had taken the measurements. His grip strength was not meaningfully affected. At level 10, he had breathed out slowly through his nose, looked at the ceiling for approximately 8 seconds, and then looked back at her and said, "That is the most uncomfortable I have been in recent memory. I had a field extraction last year that I would rank about equal." He paused. "I am okay to continue if the data is useful." She had ended the session at level 10 not because he was unable to continue, but because she needed time to review what she had collected, and because two of her research assistants had developed expressions that she, in 20 years of working with research teams, associated with people who needed a break. The team meeting that evening was not in the study protocol. Dr. Preth called it because she believed that what the team had observed required discussion before the study continued. She was a careful scientist. She did not want to draw conclusions from day 3 alone. But day 3 had produced enough anomalous data that she needed to know whether her team had observed what she believed they had observed. They had. Research assistant Veth, who was 24 years old and had joined the Xenobiology division 6 months earlier, and had specifically requested the human study because it sounded interesting, had taken more notes unrequired and was currently staring at them. He said the intensity level 10 reading on the physiological monitors. Dr. Preth said yes. He said the stress indicators were at a level that our models associate with serious physical distress. She said yes. He said he was talking normally. She said yes. He said he was asking about lunch. She said at level 8, at level 10 he was not asking about lunch, he was breathing carefully. Veth looked at his notes, he said, he asked if the data was useful. She said yes. Veth said while experiencing level 10 stimulus intensity. She said yes. He put down his notes. He picked them up again, he said, should we adjust the protocol parameters? She said, that is one of the things I want to discuss, yes. She looked at the team. What we observed today does not fit the standard model for pain response as a biological limit indicator. The standard model assumes that pain response is a signal from the body to the brain indicating that a physical limit is being approached, and that behavior changes in response to that signal in ways that protect the organism from exceeding the limit. She paused. What we observed today suggests that in this species, the signal and the behavioral response have been substantially decoupled. Another research assistant, Dr. Krell, who had been quiet during the meeting, said, "How?" Dr. Preth said, "That is what we need to find out." She paused. "I have some preliminary theories, but I want more data before I commit to them." Krell said, "What are your preliminary theories?" She said that this species has developed, through some combination of evolutionary pressure and deliberate conditioning, the ability to receive the signal without the standard behavioral response. She paused. The signal is there. The physiological indicators confirm that the stimulus was registering as pain, but the behavioral chain from pain signal to avoidance behavior has been, in some meaningful sense, interrupted. She paused. She said he decided not to avoid. The room was quiet. Veth said he decided. She said that appears to be what the data shows, yes. She looked at her team, which means we are not studying a biological threshold. We are studying a decision architecture. Krell said that is not xenobiology. She said, it is the most interesting thing I have encountered in 40 years of xenobiology. She picked up her notes. I would like to continue the study. Days 4 through 6 produced more data of the same category. Webb was cooperative throughout. He was in fact enthusiastic in the way that people are enthusiastic when they believe they are contributing to something useful. He asked questions about the research methodology. He offered observations about his own experience during the assessments that Dr. Preth found invaluable, and that did not fit any existing category in her analytical frameworks. On day 4, at intensity level 7, he had said, "Can I describe what this feels like from the inside? It might be useful for the data." Oh, she had said, "Yes, please." He had said, "It feels like there is a thing that very much wants me to stop doing this. And there is another thing that is looking at the first thing and deciding whether what the first thing wants is a good enough reason to stop." He paused. "Right now, the second thing has decided it is not a good enough reason." He paused again. "The first thing is unhappy about this." Dr. Preth had written this down verbatim. On day 5, she had asked him to describe the decision process in more detail. He had said, "It is not a rational process. I do not think through the reasons. It is more like," he had paused for a while, "it is more like there is a setting, and the setting determines what level of signal from the first thing is enough to change the behavior of the second thing." He paused. "The setting can be adjusted by circumstance. If my team needed me to keep going in a field situation, the setting would be different than it is right now. Right now, the setting is at the level where I will continue because the data is useful and I said I would." He paused. "If I were alone with no reason to continue, the setting would probably be lower." Well, she said the setting can be changed by context. He said, yes, he thought about it. It is like a volume control for how much the first thing is allowed to affect the second thing. External factors turn the volume down. They do not make the signal quieter. They make it matter less. She said, what kinds of external factors? He said, mission, team, something that matters. He paused. When something that matters is at stake, the volume goes down a long way. He looked at her. I have been in situations where the volume was so low that I was not really tracking the signal at all. Afterward, I found out I had injuries I had not noticed. She made several notes. She said, that is remarkable. He said, is it? He seemed genuinely curious. It is pretty normal among the Marines. She said, it is not normal among any other species we have studied. He thought about this, then he said, huh, he paused. What do other species do? She said, when the pain signal reaches a certain intensity, they stop. Reliably. The signal is sufficient to override other considerations. He said, that sounds sensible actually. He paused. Our version has some downsides. You can miss things that you should probably not miss. Oh, she said, such as injuries. He said, among other things, he smiled. My co said I needed better self-preservation instincts. She was probably right. She made a note. Then she said, can I ask you something personal? He said, sure. She said, when did you develop this? The volume control. She paused. Were you born with it or did you build it? He was quiet for a moment. A genuine quiet, not the comfortable quiet of someone who was fine with what was being asked, but the quiet of someone who was considering whether to answer fully. Then he said, I think I was born with some of it. My family has a thing for stubborn. He smiled briefly, but a lot of it was built. Training, situations, learning what you can push through and what you cannot, and developing a sense for the difference. He paused, and also just having things that mattered enough that the signal did not get to win. She said things that mattered. He said people, mission, the sense that stopping would cost something I was not willing to pay. He looked at her. You can push through a lot if stopping would mean leaving someone behind. He paused. I learned that one in the field and I never unlearned it. She wrote for a while without speaking. Then she said, thank you for explaining that. He said, is it useful? She said, it is the most useful data I have collected in this study. She paused. It is possibly the most useful data I have collected in my career. He said, good. He settled back. Should we continue? Days 7 through 11 were why the incident report was filed. Not because anything went wrong. Nothing went wrong. No one was harmed. Webb remained cooperative and good-humored throughout, asked intelligent questions, ate lunch enthusiastically, and in the evenings read from his extensive collection of personal reading material in the station common room, while several of the research team found reasons to also be in the common room, and asked him questions about things that were not related to the study. The incident report was filed because of what was observed. On day 7, Dr. Preth had introduced a new assessment format, not the single stimulus protocol but a sustained load protocol, designed to measure how the physiological indicators changed over time under continuous stimulus. The sustained load protocol had never been used at the intensities that Webb had demonstrated tolerance for, because no previous subject had demonstrated tolerance at those intensities. She had briefed Webb on what the protocol involved. He had said how long. She had said ideally 60 minutes. We can stop earlier if needed. He had said, what does 60 minutes tell you that 30 minutes does not? She had explained the data rationale. He had said, okay, 60 minutes. He paused. Can I have some water first? The 60-minute sustained protocol at intensity level 6 began at 900 hours. At the 30-minute mark, Webb's physiological indicators were elevated but stable. His behavior was unchanged. He was, as far as the monitors could determine, managing in the same way he had been managing at the beginning. At the 45-minute mark, research assistant Veth had looked at the data stream and then at Webb and then back at the data stream. He had said quietly to Dr. Preth, the indicators are not changing. She had said, I know. He had said they should be changing. 45 minutes of sustained level 6. The fatigue accumulation alone should be showing up. She had said, I know. He had said, why are they not changing? She had said, after a pause, I believe that what we are measuring is not a limit. I believe we are measuring a decision that he is making continuously. Veth had looked at Webb. Webb had been looking at the sailing with the focused, distant expression of someone who was working on something internal and was very committed to the work. At 60 minutes, Dr. Preth had ended the session. Webb had said, good data. She had said, extraordinary data. He had said, great. He had stood up from the chair and stretched in the way of someone whose muscles were informing him that they had strong opinions about the last hour. He said, is there coffee somewhere? There was coffee. Well, he drank it. Dr. Preth had held a team meeting that afternoon in which she had described what they had observed to the full research team, including 3 colleagues who had not been present for the morning session, and who listened to the description with the expressions of people who were not fully certain they had understood. Dr. Krell had said 60 minutes. She had said yes. He had said at level 6. She had said yes. He had said, and the indicators did not escalate. She had said they stayed stable from the 30-minute mark through to the end. She paused. In every previous subject, sustained load at even level 3 produces indicator escalation beginning around the 15-minute mark. The escalation is a biological response to accumulating tissue stress. It is not a decision. It is chemistry. She paused. In Webb, the indicators behaved as though the chemistry was receiving instructions from a different source. The room was quiet. Veth had said the volume control. She had said yes. He had said he turned it down for 60 minutes. She had said he did not turn it down. Turning it down would have shown in the indicators. The signal was present. She had stopped. She had started again. He decided that the signal was not the most important information available to him at that moment, and he maintained that decision for 60 minutes, and the maintaining of the decision was sufficiently complete that the chemistry followed the decision rather than the other way around. Krell had said that is not how biology works. She had said, I know. He had said biology drives decisions. decisions do not drive biology. She had said, in every other species we have studied, yes. He had said, you are saying that in humans, sometimes, the decision drives the biology. She had said, I am saying that what we observed is consistent with that interpretation and inconsistent with every other interpretation I can construct from the data. She had paused. I am not comfortable with that conclusion. I am more uncomfortable ignoring what the data shows. On day 10, during the debrief session after the morning assessment, Veth had asked Webb the question that everyone on the team had been building toward since day 3. He had said, when you are in the sustained protocol, what are you thinking about? Webb had considered this with the genuine attention he gave most questions. He had said it changes. He paused. At the beginning, I am mostly thinking about the assessment, monitoring where I am, checking the calibration on the decision. He paused. After a while, that becomes more automatic and I can think about other things. Veth had said, what other things? Webb had said, today I was thinking about a thing my team went through in the Kepler system 2 years ago. He paused. We were in a bad position for about 90 minutes. He paused again. Thinking about that made today feel manageable. Veth had said, you compared today to a worse situation to make today easier. Webb had said, it is a standard technique. Marines use it a lot. He paused. You find something that was harder than what you are doing now and you hold it in mind and the current thing looks smaller next to it. He looked at Veth. Does that make sense? Veth had said yes. He had paused. That is extraordinary. Webb had said it works for most things, not everything. There are situations that you cannot make look smaller. He had paused. Those are different. Veth had said, what do you do in those situations? Webb had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, you find the people next to you. He had looked at Veth. You stop looking at the thing that you cannot make smaller and you look at the people next to you and you remember that they are also in it and that matters more than the size of the thing. He had paused. The thing does not get smaller, but you stop being alone with it. He had paused again. That helps more than the comparison technique. It is slower to work, but it holds longer. Veth had written for a long time without speaking. Then he had said, you have a system. Webb had said, everyone has a system. You find what works and you use it. He had looked at Veth with the direct attention that Dr. Preth had noted on day 1. Has studying us been what you expected? Veth had said no. Webb had said better or worse. Veth had said after a pause more. Webb had said yeah. He had smiled. We are usually more. The incident report concluded with a section that Dr. Preth had titled Preliminary Conclusions and Revised Framework Recommendations. It read, based on 11 days of observation, we conclude that the standard xenobiological model for pain response as biological limit indicator requires significant revision when applied to the human species. Specifically, the assumption that pain response functions as a hard limit on behavior is not supported by the observed data. Human pain response functions as one input among multiple inputs into a decision architecture that retains the capacity to override biological signals under conditions where the decision to override is sufficiently motivated. It continued, the motivational factors that enable this override include but are not limited to mission relevance, social obligation, comparison to PR. Evious experiences classified by the subject as more demanding and what the study subject described as having something that matters enough. The last factor is the most significant and the least amenable to external modeling. The subject was unable to precisely define the threshold at which something becomes sufficiently meaningful to enable full override. He described it as a felt quality rather than a calculated one. It continued, we recommend that future studies of human subjects in any context involving physical or psychological stress parameters include explicit briefings on this characteristic. because the absence of behavioral pain avoidance response should not be interpreted as absence of pain signal. The subject was experiencing the signal throughout all assessments. He was making continuous decisions about its relevance. These are not the same thing, and confusing them leads to systematic misinterpretation of the data. It continued, we also recommend, as noted at the beginning of this report, that the research team be provided access to counseling resources. Several team members have reported that observing a biological system operating in the manner described above, specifically the sustained protocol sessions, produced a response in them that they are having difficulty categorizing. Research assistant Veth described it as something between admiration and alarm. Dr. Krell described it as making him want to reconsider several assumptions he had held for his entire career. The division head will also confess, in the privacy of this report to the Oversight Committee, that she found the experience of conducting this study more affecting than she had anticipated, and that the question Webb asked on day 10, specifically "What are you thinking about?" is one that she is still thinking about. She had paused before writing the final paragraph. Then she had written, the subject, for his part, appears to have found the study enjoyable. On day 11, he had asked whether there would be follow-up sessions and had expressed genuine interest in seeing the final research paper. He had also left a handwritten note for the research team in the station common room. It said, and we are quoting directly because the exact language matters, "Thanks for having me." This was genuinely interesting, and I learned things about myself that I did not know, which is the best kind of trip. You are all excellent scientists, and your questions were better than most of the questions I get asked. If you ever need another human for a study, I am available. I have a high pain tolerance, and I am very curious about things. Both of those are relevant qualifications. Good luck with the paper. I hope it is useful. The note had been framed. It was hanging in the division break room. Dr. Preth had approved the framing. She felt it was appropriate. If this story made you laugh and then made you feel something real underneath the laugh, if the image of a Marine asking about lunch at intensity level 8, while two research assistants tried to process what they were looking at gave you exactly the right kind of feeling, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Every week we bring you the best HFY science fiction, the stories that find what humanity is from the outside looking in, and remind you that from the outside we are a great deal more than anyone expects. Subscribe right now, hit the bell, share this story with someone today who needs to smile, and then think about something important. We are still here. We are still asking if the data is useful. We are always still here. The Oversight Committee's response to the incident report arrived 3 weeks later. It was longer than Oversight Committee responses typically were. Oversight committees were not, as a rule, given to extended commentary. They reviewed, they approved or declined. They issued recommendations where necessary. They did not typically write 4 pages of questions. This committee wrote 4 pages of questions. The questions fell into 3 categories. The first category was methodological. These were the standard questions: sample size concerns, protocol validation queries, requests for the raw data sets, normal oversight function. Dr. Preth answered them in her standard precise style and moved on. The second category was biological. These questions were less standard. They asked for clarification on the physiological mechanisms underlying the observed decoupling between pain signal and behavioral response. They asked whether the pattern had been observed in other human subjects or was specific to this individual. They asked whether the observed pattern was trainable or innate or some combination. These questions Dr. Preth answered with the honest acknowledgement that the study had raised more questions than it had answered, which was the correct scientific position and which she knew would generate a follow-up study request. The third category was the 1T. A hat had prompted the 4 pages. The committee chair had written in her own hand at the bottom of the third category, "I have read this report 4 times. I keep returning to the note he left in the break room. Specifically the part where he said he learned things about himself that he did not know. She paused in her writing, a subject who volunteered for a pain tolerance study and came out of it saying the experience was interesting and that he had learned things about himself. She paused again. I would like to understand this better. Can you arrange a follow-up interview, not a formal assessment, a conversation? I would like to talk to him myself. Dr. Preth read this part of the response and wrote back, he is back on active duty. I have forwarded your request through the diplomatic exchange liaison. He has been informed. His response received this morning was enthusiastic. He said, and I am quoting, absolutely yes, I have questions too. The follow-up interview was scheduled for the following month. Webb arrived for the follow-up interview in the same way he had arrived for everything, with 2 bags and an energy level that the station logs would again describe as immediately notable. Except this time the station staff recognized him from the framed note in the break room and greeted him accordingly. The committee chair, Scholar Veth the Elder, a being of 70 years and considerable distinction, met him in the station's primary meeting room. She had prepared questions. She had also prepared herself for the fact that her questions might not be the questions that mattered, based on Dr. Preth's observation that Webb's own questions tended to be better than expected. He sat down across from her and looked at her with the direct attention that the research team had documented on day 1 of the original study, the full presence quality that she had read about in the notes, and that was, in person, as notable as the notes suggested. He said, thank you for meeting with me. He paused. I read the incident report. She said, Dr. Preth shared it with you. He said she asked if I wanted to see it. I said yes. He paused. The framing recommendation at the end made me laugh. He smiled. I did not expect to end up framed. She said, you left an excellent note. He said, I meant it. It was a good study. He looked at her. You had questions for me. She said many, but first, as Dr. Preth mentioned, you said you had questions too. He said one main one. He paused. In the incident report, Dr. Preth wrote that several team members found the sustained protocol sessions affecting. Research assistant Veth described it as something between admiration and alarm. He looked at her. I want to understand the alarm part. She said, you want to understand why observing you produced alarm. He said yes, because I was not alarmed. What I was doing did not feel alarming from the inside. He paused, but the report suggests it looked different from the outside. He looked at her directly. I would like to understand that gap. She considered this. Then she said, for most species, including the keth, pain response functions as a boundary. When you reach it, you stop. This is not a choice, it is a reflex. The biology prevents you from exceeding the boundary in the way that a physical wall prevents you from walking through it. She paused. Observing someone proceed past that boundary as though it were not there produces, in species for whom it is a wall, something like watching someone walk through a wall. She paused. It is not dangerous. You were fine, but it looks like something that should not be possible, and things that look like they should not be possible produce a specific kind of response in observers. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, does it look like we are broken? She said no, she was certain about this. It looks like you are built differently. She paused. Broken would imply the wall is there but not working. What we observed was the wall not being there in the same way. She paused. It is not absence of function. It is different architecture. He said the decision architecture thing. She said yes. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, can I tell you something that might be relevant to the alarm question? She said, please. He said the volume control thing I described to Dr. Preth. The way I can turn down how much the pain signal affects behavior. He paused. It does not feel like strength from the inside. It feels like a tool. He looked at her. And like any tool, it can be used well or badly. He paused. I have used it badly before. Pushed through things I should not have pushed through because the volume was too low and I missed signals that mattered. He paused. The research team saw the capability without the cost. The cost is real. It exists. He looked at her steadily. The alarm is correct, not because what you saw was wrong or broken, but because a capability that powerful without judgment out when to use it would be dangerous. He paused. The judgment is the part you cannot see from the outside. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Dr. Preth wrote in her notes that you are among the most self-aware subjects she has studied. He said she was being generous. He paused. I have had situations that taught me things. Some of them taught me about limits I had missed. He looked at her. The best thing about your study was that it made me look at something I do all the time without thinking about it. He paused. I think about it more now. Oh, she said, what do you think about it? He said, I think the volume control is valuable when the thing you are pushing through is worth pushing through. He paused. And I think one of the hardest parts of being human is knowing the difference. He looked at her. We are very good at finding reasons why the thing is worth it. We are less naturally good at questioning whether the reason is sound. She wrote for a while. Then she said, you came to a pain tolerance study and you learned something about judgment. He said, you asked better questions than I usually get asked. He paused. Good questions make you find things you did not know were there. She said, that was what you wrote in the note. He said it was true. She looked at him, she said, can I ask you the question that is actually at the center of all of this? Oh, he said, yes. She said, how did you build it? The judgment. The knowledge of when to use the capability and when not to. She paused, not the capability itself, the wisdom around it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I did not build it, I accumulated it. He paused, through the situations, through the times I got it wrong and what that cost, through the people who showed me by example what it looked like to get it right. He paused, and through conversations like this one where someone asked me a question I had to actually think about. He looked at her. You build judgment the same way you build everything that matters. One experience at a time. He paused. There are no shortcuts. He paused again. Believe me, Marines have looked. She made a note. She almost smiled. She said, one more question. He said, sure. She said, the note said you are very curious about things. What are you most curious about right now? He looked at her. He said whether the thing I described as the volume control exists in your species in a different form. Not the same mechanism, something analogous. He paused. Every species has something they push through. Every species has things that matter enough to change the calculation. He looked at her. I want to know what it looks like in you. He paused. Because I think understanding that might be more useful than anything in the study data. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she put down her prepared questions. She said, that is a very good question. He said, you had 40 years of good questions from Dr. Preth. I am working with 11 days and a follow-up interview. She said, you are not working from disadvantage. He said, I know. He smiled. I just like to know where I am starting from. She said, where would you like to start? He thought about it. Then he said, tell me about the thing that makes your volume control go down, the thing that matters enough. He looked at her. I will tell you about mine, and we can compare notes. The conversation that followed was not in any protocol. It was not documented in the official study record. It lasted 4 hours and produced no formal data. It produced something else. The committee chair wrote a personal note in her private journal that evening. She wrote, he asked me the most important question anyone has asked me in 30 years of oversight work. And then he answered it for himself, and the answer was exactly what I had been circling around for 3 weeks without being able to say it directly. She paused. The volume control is not the capability. The volume control is the relationship between the capability and the things that matter. She paused. And the things that matter are not measurable from the outside. They are only expressible. She paused. I have been trying to measure something that can only be expressed. Webb expressed it in 4 hours. She paused in her writing. She wrote, the note is still in the break room. I looked at it again on the way out. She paused one more time. She wrote, "Good luck with the paper. I hope it is useful." It was. If this story made you smile and then made you think and then made you feel something true about what we are, if the image of the framed note in the break room or Webb asking the committee chair what her volume control goes down for stayed with you, then this channel is yours. Every week we bring you the best HFY science fiction, the stories that look at humanity from the outside and find every time that we are more than anyone expected and more complicated than anyone planned for. Subscribe, Rick. Now, hit the bell. Share this with someone today who needs a reminder that the things that look like our limits are sometimes just the beginning of the question. We are still here. We are still asking if the data is useful. We always will be. The study paper was published 14 months after Webb's original visit. Its full title was Pain Response Decoupling in Human Subjects, a preliminary framework for understanding decision architecture override of biological limit indicators, with notes on methodological revision requirements for cross-species biological assessment. The abstract was 3 paragraphs. The paper itself was 42 pages. The appendices were 63 pages. The acknowledgement section was unusual for a scientific paper in that it was 2 full pages and included, at Dr. Preth's insistence, a direct quote from Webb's note from the break room. She had argued to the editorial board that the quote was primary source material relevant to the study's conclusions. The editorial board, having read the paper, had agreed. The paper was the most read xenobiology publication in the Keth Research Collective's history within 3 months of publication. It was translated into 11 languages. It was cited in 47 subsequent papers within the first year. Research assistant Veth, who had written more notes than required on day 3 and who had described the experience as something between admiration and alarm, was listed as second author. It was his first published paper. He had not expected to be listed as second author. He had expected to be in the acknowledgments. Dr. Preth had said, "The second author listing is correct. Your observations on days 3 through 11 were integral to the conclusions, and your questions were better than mine on several occasions." He had said, "My questions were not better than yours." She had said, the question about what he was thinking about during the sustained protocol. "You asked that one." He had said, "That seemed like the obvious question." She had looked at him. He had said, "Oh." She had said, "Yes, obvious questions are sometimes the most important ones." She had paused. "That is a thing I have learned from this study." He had been second author on the paper. He had also been the one who, 6 months after publication, received a message from Webb through the diplomatic exchange channel. Webb had written, "I read the paper. It is very good. The second author's observational notes are particularly sharp." He paused in the message. "The part where you documented me asking about lunch at level 8 made me actually laugh out loud. I had forgotten about that." He paused. "I wanted to tell you that reading the paper was useful for me. You documented things about my own behavior that I had not fully articulated to myself. Seeing them written down by someone watching from the outside helped me understand them from the inside." He paused. "That is the best thing good science does. It shows you something true about the thing you are studying." He paused. "Thank you for doing it well." Veth had read the message 3 times. Then he had written back, "Thank you for being an excellent subject." And for the note, "It is still in the break room." Webb had written, "Good." He paused. "If you ever do a follow-up study, I am still available. I have more questions now than I did before the first study, which is usually a sign that something was done right." Veth had written, "We are planning a follow-up study." Webb had written back immediately, "When do I come in?" The follow-up study was scheduled for the following spring. The research team was unanimously looking forward to it. They had learned, in the 11 days of the original study and the months of analysis that followed, that the most interesting data was not in the numbers. It was in the questions that the numbers raised. And the questions that the numbers raised about humans were, without exception, more interesting than the questions they had started with. That was, Dr. Preth had concluded, the reliable indicator of a good study. Not that it answered what you asked, that it showed you what you should have been asking. If this story is still with you, if you're still thinking about the note in the break room and the volume control and the way Webb asked the committee chair what her own version looked like, then you already know what this channel is for. Every week, stories about humanity that find the truth. Subscribe right now. Hit the bell, share this today. We are still here. We still leave notes. We are always still here.